Jocelyn here. Welcome to Grow Like a Pro with Joe, my monthly webinar series where I introduce and remind folks about the importance of regenerative growing. Today we are talking all about tips on how to plan and set up your garden or your growing space for regenerative growing success. I'm so happy you guys are here today and joining us. I know there are a lot of new faces, a lot of new names on the registrant list, and I can see already that folks are filing in. Hello, Natalia, Eva, Susan, Laura. Who else have we got here? Barbara, we have Anne, we have a whole bunch of folks joining us, and I'm super thrilled that it's a new group, a mostly new group here today. I am going to talk about a few different things. I'm going to spend the first 30 to 40 minutes providing instruction. I have some slides to share if I can get the tech to work properly. And certainly I want to introduce you to regenerative growing. Most important is, first and foremost, I want to help you appreciate the 6 principles of regenerative growing and why they're so important. Because once you understand the principles, it's much easier to adopt them and adapt them for your particular growing space. And in fact, that's one of the best things about regenerative growing, for example, versus organic growing, which is very strict and has a lot of standards and protocols. Regenerative growing as a whole is much more welcoming and flexible, allows for you to adopt different principles or techniques that are best suited to your situation. So the first piece will really be about a quick introduction to my business, to Jocelyn Soil Booster, why it's a truly regenerative business. And then we'll be talking a bit about soil health, the soil food web, and then talking about those regenerative principles. I then want to give you some specific examples. I have a few demos to give and show for you on how I would suggest you can incorporate regenerative growing into your backyard or on your balcony. And for those last 20, 15 minutes or so, I'm going to be taking questions. So if you have a question throughout the session, feel free to drop it in the chat. I will be taking a look at those at the end or near the end of the session, and we'll be answering questions at that time. We will also have a special discount code for those of you who are interested in taking advantage of that, and that will be near towards the end of the session as well. So I just want to see, do we have any more? Giselle, Chris, Mohammed, thank you for joining us. We've got a good group, and we're about 5 minutes in here, so I think we're going to get started. I am going to share some slides, and I have to admit that I've been doing these webinars for a while, and it's been some time since I've shared some slides. But this education piece around regenerative growing is so critical to understand that I really think it would be best if we're going to be successful with helping you guys understand and appreciating what it is that we are talking about. So I'm going to look at these slides. I'm going to bring them up. And if someone could just pop into the chat and let me know that they're seeing the slide up on their screen. It should say microbes facilitate a win-win-win. And I'm getting some thumbs up here. So that's great. All right. So this is really where I like to start the introduction for this webinar, because it's important to appreciate that regenerative growing is all about the microbes. They're really the ones responsible for a win-win-win scenario that allows you to be successful in your growing space. And that's because when we feed our soil, when we look after the microbes that are in the soil, we're able to grow the healthiest food possible, the type of food that is rich in nutrients and that is going to feed our family the way we want it to. And it also allows us to fight climate change. And that's because microbes are directly responsible for partnering with plants to sequester carbon. They pull the carbon out of the air through photosynthesis and put it back in the ground to feed the microbes. That's what we're going to be talking about. I always like to start with this introduction around Waste Not Farms, my business, as a regenerative business, and it's closed loop. So this word regenerative is often misunderstood or misappreciated. And really what it means is that we are improving the environment or improving the ecosystem over time. We're building up resources instead of depleting them. And this is, of course, in contrast to chemical growing, where we're constantly causing damage to the soil, to the ecosystem. So as a business, my business represents this regenerative growing style because it's constantly getting stronger and growing and improving our ecosystem. So really quickly, what we do here is we collect food waste, we collect agricultural waste like waste sheep wool and horse manure or restaurant compost, and we feed it to worms. I have about 5 million red wigglers in my barn, and they chomp away on that food. And eventually we harvest the worm manure, we screen it so it's really fine consistency, and we bag it. And folks call this like a biofertilizer because it's a biological fertilizer. It's the microbiology that is really causing the benefit and creating that improvement. A lot of people would also just call it worm castings. That is the technical name. What we're talking about ultimately is worm poop. That is this powerful biological amendment that we can add to our soil to create this ongoing benefit that we call regenerative growing. And of course, that's what happens is we grow healthy food, healthy people, and a healthy planet. And those plants are then becoming waste, and it's a nice circular zero waste format. But what's really powerful in the regenerative piece is that the more we feed my worms, the more the worms grow. They double, in fact, every month when they're kept in the correct conditions. And so their ability to process food waste also grows and grows as the system strengthens, creating more healthy biological amendment to grow more healthy food and ultimately strengthen the overall ecosystem. To really understand why this is important, it is critical. I quickly mentioned something about soil, and that is that soil is about half of it is mineral based, just under half. And so that's the type of thing we're talking sand, silt, and clay. The other half of soil is pore space. And depending on environmental conditions, this is either air pockets, when it's very wet or in wet environments, those air pockets can be filled with water. And those air pockets or that porosity is created or available when there is good structure in the soil. The actual living component of soil, that's a very small amount. It's only about 5%. We call that the organic component. And this is anything that was living at one time. So all the little insects, all the little creatures, the plants, any dead material, dead plants, dead organics, they all are only about 5% of what we're looking at in the soil. Traditionally, people have talked about soil as 3 separate components: physical, chemical, and biological. And what's really critical for you to understand as you're beginning your regenerative growing journey is that the biological component is what's most important. It's the biology that creates healthy physical structure, that creates that porosity or those pore spaces that are so important to healthy soil. It's the microbiology that influences the pH level, the chemical components that are available in the soil that degrade toxic materials if it's there. Ultimately, when we look after the biology in soil, we look after all the critical components of soil. The last thing I really wanted to show that was important today is around the soil food web, because if you haven't been introduced to this, it is really foundational to regenerative growing. Dr. Elaine Ingham, who unfortunately just passed away recently, she's considered the grandmother. She was the grandmother of regenerative growing. She was the first person to look under a microscope and see this massive amount of life that exists in soil that we cannot detect with our naked eye. And I highly recommend take a look at soilfoodweb.com. Her Soil Food Web Institute has amazing resources if you really want to dig in, so to speak, to this topic. But what you can see here, what this image illustrates, is that plants pull carbon out of the air through the process of photosynthesis. And that carbon, but some of it goes into creating bigger leaves or a flowering part of the plant or growing their roots out. But about half of the carbon that plants pull out of the atmosphere actually gets excreted into soil. And this carbon is a type of sugar. It's a carbohydrate is what it is. And that is to feed the microbiology in the soil. In the soil food web, we need to have two components, and I'm only going to speak about them at a high level. We need our primary decomposers and we need our secondary decomposers. And if we don't have a mix of both classifications, we're not going to be able to feed the plants the right nutrient at the right time. Primary decomposers are things like bacteria or fungi. And these are the organisms that can take mineral matter, things like sand, silt, and clay, and they have enzymes that break that down to pull apart individual molecules. So for example, let's say we have a type of bacteria that likes calcium. This bacteria can find a sand particle, it can excrete enzymes that disconnect the calcium and allow the bacteria to absorb that calcium. It's had its nutrients for the day. That bacteria can kick back and relax until tomorrow when it will go out and find one more calcium to eat. How this calcium will ultimately feed our plants is where our secondary decomposers become critical. These organisms are slightly bigger. They're things like protozoa, like amoeba or nematodes. And these secondary decomposers eat the primary decomposers. But they don't just eat one a day or two a day. An amoeba can eat 10,000 bacteria each and every day. So you can imagine if each of those bacteria had one molecule of calcium, that amoeba has then absorbed 10,000 molecules of calcium in that one particular day. That amount of calcium is toxic to that amoeba. It's way too much. So it immediately excretes it out and into the soil, and it excretes it in a bioavailable format. That is when, and it's only when the plant is able to absorb the right calcium that it needs. Up until then, that calcium was not available to the plant. So this is why in a healthy soil ecosystem, in a regenerative growing practice, diversity is critical. And you're going to hear me say that again and again. Diversity is critical because it is what allows so many different components of the soil to be accessible to the plant. The plant will ask for nutrients, it will put the carbohydrates out in the soil. That's the language it uses to communicate with the biology. It will ask for calcium or magnesium or boron. The plant knows what it needs, but it can't get it alone. It needs these primary and secondary decomposers to help it access the right nutrients at the right time. So when we're growing regeneratively, that is ultimately what we're trying to do, is ensure that there's a diversity of this microbiology in the soil, allowing the plants to partner with whichever niche organisms it needs to be successful and to grow healthy and strong. This is also why when you grow regeneratively, your food is healthier. It has a greater diversity of nutrients, of metabolites, of the healthy molecules that we need ourselves to grow big and strong. because when there's biology in the soil, the plant is able to ask and get on demand those right nutrients. Whereas in chemical growing, the biology has been killed. Those chemicals are toxic, of course. They've killed the biology, and the plant is really stuck only absorbing the fertilizer that the farmer or that the grower provides it, which is a very narrow band of nutrients. And so that's a brief introduction to the soil food web and why it is such a critical piece to regenerative growing. So I want to dive in now to the next stages, the next steps, or those principles of regenerative growing so that you really understand what they're all about. The first principle of regenerative growing is to keep your soil covered, or planted is actually the best option. So if we're talking about why this is so critical, I want to really help you guys appreciate what's happening here. So I'm going to show you here. Of course, this is just a little potted plant, and I want to help you appreciate that these roots that we see under here are actually creating huge amounts of surface area and structure in the soil. And this is what helps prevent erosion, and it's also what feeds the microbiology. So one of the critical first pieces to appreciate with regenerative growing is, when possible, you always want to have plants in the ground and roots in the ground. The easiest way to do this is with perennials, or plants that are living all the time in the soil. This isn't always possible, of course, because we have lots of annual plants like tomatoes and peppers, all those things that we love to grow in our food gardens. A lot of them tend to be annuals. But the first tip I would recommend is see if you can find ways to grow some perennial plants in your growing spaces. So these would be things like berries, things like asparagus, even rhubarb. These are all food plants that come back year after year. And the benefit is that they're keeping their roots in the ground. They're feeding that microbiology. If there aren't any roots in the ground, then the biology is going to die off. The other benefit, of course, to having roots in the ground is it helps with erosion. And I wanted to try this little experiment. I haven't actually tried this, but I want to pour this water in here. And because there's no roots in this container, the soil is going to infiltrate down very quickly. And you can imagine if there was roots planted in this container, the soil is going to hold that structure much, much more readily. This is why having plants in your ground as much as possible is really, really important. Now, sometimes there are off seasons when it's simply not possible. So at this time of year, we haven't been able to get out into our gardens yet. We haven't been able to plant our heat-loving crops yet. What are you going to do? You have a few options. The first option is to cover the ground with some kind of ground cover. My personal preference for this would be something like wood chips, or perhaps you have access to other organic mulch. Something like straw would work, something like dead leaves from last year. There's lots and lots of options for a natural mulch that can be used to cover the soil. Even in a container that you're growing on a patio or raised beds, you ideally want to have the soil always covered with a mulch if you can't be growing items. So it's really simple. You're just going to spread the mulch on, and it's going to serve a few purposes. It's going to keep the soil covered so that the moisture is locked in. And moisture is so critical in regenerative growing because all those microbes that I've been talking about, they actually live in water. They need a moist environment to do their job, to partner with the plant and provide those nutrients. So the quickest way to cause negative impacts, either in your house plants or even out in your garden, is to let things dry out. When they dry out, the microbes go dormant, and they're not able to feed the plant anymore. So having a mulch on your soil, especially during these off seasons, it helps to keep the moisture in the soil, keep those microbes active, and it also provides a natural organic carbon and some of those larger nutrients that over time are going to get broken down. Another critical tip with mulch is try to vary the type of mulch you use year after year. And this actually goes for almost all regenerative growing practices. When you can vary your inputs or where you place those inputs, you're going to ensure that that diversity, that community of microbiology is being kept as full spectrum as possible, as diverse as possible. We get into problems when we repeat the same inputs year after year after year, whether it's the same type of the mulch, the same plants grown in the same spot. That's when we really have concerns because there's not that wide variety anymore in the soil. So really important here is to be maintaining cover on your soil. Worst case scenario, you don't have a mulch, you've got a bare patch of sand, of soil, you are able to use something like plastic sheeting. It is a temporary solution. You're ultimately suffocating the soil when you use a plastic, so it's not something to be done for more than a couple of weeks. You could, of course, use something like cardboard. We all have lots of cardboard these days. It's not perfect. It doesn't protect the soil because it does ultimately break down after a couple of weeks or a month. But in the short term, it's a great use. Just make sure you remove all the tape first. Those are all different types of ways you can ensure you're protecting your soil, although your first choice is always to have roots in the ground feeding those microbes. All right, so let's talk about the next regenerative growing principle, which is to minimize tillage. For those of you who don't appreciate the word tillage, it's just a fancy word for digging. In regenerative growing, we want to dig in the soil as least as possible because we damage that microbial ecosystem every time we turn over the soil. You know, it used to be a best practice to try and, rototill your lawn or aerate your soil. Now we appreciate that every time we dig in our soil, we're disrupting the ecosystem and the fungal hyphae, those long connections that the microbes provide that allow plants to communicate, they get damaged and degraded when we dig in our soil. So I always get the question at this point, well, what do I do about weeds? I'm going to show you. I've got a bit of a demonstration here in terms, I just have to grab my demonstration board here. And I will bring this over, and so I have these plants, and yes, they are dead. I'm not going to lie to you; they are definitely not doing so well. And I will admit that at this time of the year, it's really hard for me to look after plants because I'm so busy looking after the worms and shipping the worm poop. But it makes for a great example. When you have weeds, so this applies in two scenarios. Either when you have weeds in your growing space and they're starting to take over your crops, you don't want to yank them out of the soil. That's going to be very disruptive to the ecosystem. Instead, what we want to do is we want to trim the top of those weeds and leave the roots in the ground. This is actually going to help to feed those microbes. Like I said, the microbes depend on roots. The other use for this technique is in the fall, when your annual plants have died, the first frost has come and you've lost your tomatoes. Again, do not pull your tomato plants out of the soil. You want to leave them in the soil and leave those roots in the ground to feed the microbial communities all winter long. What you can do, and again, The caveat here is as long as you didn't have any kind of pest or pathogen in your tomato crop, because if you did, you probably wanted to remove those plants entirely. But if you had a successful tomato harvest, what you can do is snip off the tops of your tomatoes or any other annual plants, and then you're simply going to lay that organic matter down onto the soil, and through the winter, it will be reincorporated as a beautiful humus layer for you to use in the spring. In fact, in winter is actually the best time because that winter snow on the soil creates a thin layer of water. There's an interface between the snow and the soil, and there's a thin layer of water that allows the microbes to work away on the material at the top of your soil. Most of the year, they're actually a little bit deeper than that. It's just too dry at the top of our soil. But in winter, they're able to get up there. They're able to do this excellent work where they break down the organic matter. So I highly recommend in the fall, you wanna really ensure you're putting a mulch on top of your soil. That's gonna feed that diverse ecosystem. And again, with the weeds, we don't wanna be pulling them out by hand. If you have a bigger space you're working with, I recommend using a weed whacker. That is gonna be your best option to quickly cut down those weeds, but leave those roots in the ground without disturbing the soil. All right, let's talk about the third critical principle of regenerative growing, which is cover cropping. Often we hear about this in large-scale agriculture. Folks don't realize that they can apply the same principles at home. Cover cropping is really just a fancy word for planting crops that are not to be consumed, are not to be eaten. And cover crops have other reasons that they're being planted. Usually it's to benefit the soil or benefit the plant that you are looking to consume and harvest. So few different options for cover cropping, and this is also where companion planting would sort of fall under as a regenerative principle. So I want to give you a few examples of both. Cover cropping, for example, you could use there's something called a tillage radish. So let's say you have really hard, compacted soil, and you just heard me say we can't dig into it, we don't want to disrupt that soil manually or physically. What you could use is something called a tillage radish. And this is a particular type of radish that you would plant that has a really strong taproot. It has a really strong root that grows deep, deep, deep into the soil and grows down. It accesses the nutrients that are below that really hard, compacted part of the soil. Now, here's the cool part. With a tillage radish, what you would do is you would leave it over winter. So you wouldn't harvest it in the fall. You would leave it to decompose through the winter. And in the spring, the next year, you would find that your previously very compacted, very hard soil has a bunch of nice holes in it. The holes where those tillage radishes existed, the radish would decompose by the microbes, and all of a sudden your compacted soil is much easier to work. It's been aerated naturally in a way that maintains that microbial community. So what I often say to folks is, if you're having a problem with your soil, it's often there's something that can be solved with the right type of cover crop. You just have to do a little bit of research, look online, do some Googling, see what type of cover crop can I grow that is going to naturally address this problem that I'm having with my particular soil. So again, this is an example where the biology is ultimately dictating the physical nature of the soil that you're using to grow on. That we as humans are not very good at making these physical changes to our soil, and it's much more effective when we can allow Mother Nature and biology to do it for us. The other type of cover crop I want to quickly talk about is known as a green manure. And a green manure is a cover crop that you would grow in a space of your garden where you know you want to replenish the soil, or you know, for example, that you won't be growing crops there this season. So for example, with garlic, garlic's a great option. For those of you looking to grow garlic, it is something that you plant in the fall, and it overwinters in your soil. It comes up, it's one of the first things to come up early in spring, and you're able to harvest the scapes. And then in about midsummer, usually in July, you're pulling out your garlic's ready, you're pulling out your garlic and harvesting that. Consequently, usually late July through August, you're left with a bare patch in your garden. It's a little bit too early to plant your fall cool weather crops and too late to plant any additional heat lovers. So a green manure is a great option to fill the gaps during this time of year, because remember, we always want to have roots in the ground. We always want to have plants growing in our soil, if at all possible. That's how we're going to feed those microbes and keep the soil ecosystem happy. We actually create a product that does just this. It's called our Living Mulch Cover Crop Kit. And in this product, it includes a mix of oats and pea seeds along with our world famous worm manure. And this is a great kit. It covers the space where you would have been growing your garlic, for example. Peas are an excellent cover crop because they restore nitrogen. Beans and legumes, they have a special ability to put nitrogen back in the soil, whereas most other plants that we grow are not able to do that. They depend on partnerships with other plants or with fungi. Legumes are a great cover crop because they naturally restore the nitrogen in the soil, so that whatever you grow there next is going to have lots of options in terms of nitrogen access. The oats are really useful because they grow so quickly. Within about a week, you have your oats sprouting out of the soil, and that's going to provide protection. It's going to prevent weeds from moving into that area. And again, later on, you can cut those oats down and allow that organic material to replenish the soil. So cover crops are a really exciting, interesting way to incorporate regenerative growing into your backyard garden. Highly recommend that. Next critical piece to appreciate with regenerative growing is around the importance of animals in our ecosystems. And folks always ask me, when you have a backyard or you just have a balcony, how are you supposed to incorporate animals into your growing space? Well, if we think about why they're so important in nature, animals help replenish diversity. So the example is a bird that's eating some wildflower seeds by a pond will then fly over to a growing space where it will then deposit those seeds in a pasture or field. And so animals naturally circulate diversity, not only in terms of seeds, but in terms of the actual microbial communities that we need in all our growing spaces. An easy way to mimic this replenishment by animals is through a biological fertilizer like my worm manure. And that's really one of my top recommendations of how you can apply regenerative principles. Of course, it's hard to bring animals into a small growing space, but you can certainly bring the manure of animals into a small growing space that's going to have a similar impact in terms of replenishing diversity. I always like to mention at this point the difference between like a horse manure or sheep manure product, a big bag that you might buy at Home Depot, and a worm manure of biological amendment, such as the worm manure. Horse manure or sheep manure, those big bags of compost, they're great. you want to buy them. They add mulch, they add organic material to your soil. But it's important to appreciate that they have been sanitized. There is no living biology in those bags of horse manure or sheep manure. They do that purposefully. They want to kill off any potential pathogens that could have been in there. So that material is great as a bulk input or a bulk addition, but it doesn't replenish the microbiology, that diversity that ultimately is going to be critical to feeding your plant and protecting your plant as well. Because it's the bacteria, it's the fungi, it's the amoeba and the protozoa. They're the ones that also perform first aid and provide the ability to fight off pathogens and other pests that can approach your garden. So really, you want the big bulk horse manure, but you also want a little bit of the worm manure or another biological amendment to grow the healthiest ecosystem possible. All right, so I think we're just about, we have our 6 principles of regenerative growing. I'm hoping you guys can appreciate sort of why it's really critical to understand the science behind the principles, because then you can adopt them for your particular growing space. And I want to take some questions. I'm going to help you guys sort of adapt these principles for your own growing space. It is important to appreciate that ideally you're applying all the principles. That's when you're truly going to be looking after your soil health. You're going to be replenishing the resources in your ecosystem. That is a true regenerative growing approach. However, it's also good to just start with the few that are more manageable. And again, this is why regenerative growing is so adaptable, is some of them are going to be more accessible. Perhaps it's easy for you to always have mulch on your plant, on your soil. You only have a few containers, so you always can keep your soil covered. That's great. You're going to start there, and then as you learn more, as you become more experienced with regenerative growing practices, you can pick and choose and implement some of the other techniques like the cover crop or like the companion planting to really be successful. Okay, so I want to get to some questions. I quickly want to let you guys know that the discount code for today's webinar is free mulch. Make sure I'm getting that right. Yes, free mulch, all one word. Use that at soilbooster.ca until April 30th, and you're going to get a free bag of the wood chip mulch with a purchase of any other product. And that's because this is really well suited whether you're growing indoor plants, you can cover the soil, or you're growing outdoor containers or a raised bed. Get your hands on some wood chips. You can get them free when you order through the website, and you'll be able to protect that soil, protect the biology, and maintain that moisture as you're growing. All right, so I want to make sure if anybody has questions, now's the time to put them into the chat. I'm just going to pull up the chat, and I want to be able to see if, okay, so far we don't have any questions. I'm going to give the folks, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of time to put some questions into the chat if you have them. Since I have an extra minute, for those of you who are just starting on your regenerative growing, I have a couple of best practices that you can look at implementing. So the first thing you want to do is assess your space and map your resources. And so when it comes to growing, the critical resources that you want to look at is first and foremost sunlight. Track how the sun moves across your growing space through the course of the day, and really try and figure out how many hours of sun you have available. Any more than about 7 or 8 hours, you have what's considered full sun. And you're really lucky in that case, because you can grow most plants, most crops are going to be happy in a full sun scenario. If you have anywhere between 4 to 6 or 7 hours a day, what we call is partial sun, and you're going to have to adapt what you're growing to plants that are a little bit more willing to not require full sun. So this is where you want to start doing some research. A lot of things like leafy greens, really any of the green plants like peas, beans, all of them will do perfectly well. Even the root crops, carrots, radishes, they are all going to manage just fine in partial sun. However, I have to say the heat lovers, the fruits like the tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, they struggle when they don't have full sun access. Not going to say you won't get any, but what I would recommend is the less sun you have, look for the varieties or the varietals of plants that are produce smaller fruit more quickly. So something like a cherry tomato is going to be more successful in a growing space that has less than full sun. The other resource that's really important to assess in your growing area is water. And I mentioned this earlier. I mentioned that microbes need to be wet to do their job of feeding plants. And so ensuring that you have access to water readily is really important. It seems really basic, but so many growers sort of forget about where is their water attachment. And I should say, because I know a lot of folks are living in the city, you know, our products are really perfect for those of you in urban or suburban areas because they're small formatted and they're super concentrated. The thing with city water is it's chlorinated. And that is a big problem because chlorine is a disinfectant. And what that means is it's killing biology. And so what I highly recommend is if you can find a way to water your garden with water that is not chlorinated, so rainwater, like a rain barrel, that's a type of regenerative growing approach because you're really helping to ensure that microbial ecosystem is being looked after. Another way, if you don't have access to a rain barrel, you can also let your water sit out. So take that tap water, put it on the counter for 24 hours, and that chlorine is actually going to vaporize. You can then use that water to water your plants and not worry about it effectively disinfecting the microbial community in your plants. There is also a few other options, like humic acid is a natural material that you can buy that will also clean chlorine from water. So want to flag that for those of you in urban spaces. City water is chlorinated and using it directly is not technically a regenerative approach. For those of you who, again, are setting up, and it looks like we got a question, so I'll get there in a second. You want to, where you can, create beds that are going to be perennial beds. And so for us, for example, we have some rhubarb in a garden bed, and we know that this particular bed is where we are not going to be planting annual plants. We always want to have perennial plants in that space so that we're not having to dig up the soil or remove the annual plants or plant them in. That's going to help ensure the widest diversity of an ecosystem. It's also going to tip the scales towards a more fungally dominant soil. Haven't had time to get into that. It's a little bit more advanced than we have time for, but it is important to appreciate that every time we disturb the soil, it encourages bacterial growth. And most plants actually prefer a soil that has a balance of bacteria and fungi. The fungi are really the microbes that cannot handle being disturbed. So you can imagine like an old growth forest is highly fungal, and that's what those coniferous trees need because that soil has not been disturbed. As soon as we dig in the soil, we turn it over, those fungi break apart, they cannot repopulate themselves, and that allows the soil to skew and become bacterially dominated, which are much better at replicating and using resources quickly. And that limits the types of plants that are going to be happy in that type of soil. All right, so I have a question here. Barbara, hi Barbara. So Barbara says she has a strip of side yard that is full of invasive plants. So, invasives are very difficult. There's a reason why they take over. They reproduce quickly. Their root structures are very strong. We just covered it all with cardboard and mulch, hoping to get rid of the invasive plants and put in native plants this fall. Awesome. Love the native plants. Native plants are great for diversity as well because they naturally support pollinators. And sometimes I realize people don't appreciate that our pollinators are important when we're growing food crops because they're often the ones that are required for that fruit to be created. So a tomato plant, for example, it needs to be pollinated, ideally by a pollinator. There's a way to do it yourself. But most of our fruiting crops are pollinated by these little insects. And when we grow native plants that support pollinators, we're increasing the likelihood that our food plants are going to be properly pollinated and grow those fruits. So I want to add the worm compost to help the native seedlings eventually. Would you recommend adding it in a targeted way into each planting hole or on top of the cardboard layer? Awesome question, Barbara. I love it. It's a really good one because it helps me explain something that I haven't quite gotten to. And that is that the microbes in the worm manure are dormant. We've dried them and we put them to sleep so they can be shelf stable for up to a year. As soon as you add them to the soil and they become moist, you want to actually water well after you use this product, the microbes, they wake up. And when they wake up, they're immediately going to look to partner with a plant root system. They're going to search out for those roots, and in particular, they're looking for the carbohydrates that those root systems are excreting into the soil, because that's how they know they've found their plant partner and they can create a synergistic relationship or ecosystem. The reason that's important is that if you add the worm manure or any kind of biological amendment and the roots are not there, those microbes are very quickly going to die off. They will not find their plant partners that they need to grow and to replicate and to create a healthy living ecosystem. And so they're either going to die off, or if you're lucky, they might go dormant and come back in the future. But I always recommend you're gonna get the biggest bang for your buck with this product when you use it in tandem with the planting or with plants that are already planted. So to answer your question, Barbara, use the worm manure in the hole when you're transplanting those native perennial plants in the fall. That's when those microbes are going to go to work. You don't want to add the microbes now, because what they may unintentionally have the impact of doing is helping the invasive plants. They're going to look for root systems, and microbes, they don't really have an ability to differentiate between natives and non-native plants. At least they don't for the most part. So if they find some roots, they're just going to partner with those. We want to let your invasive plants die. Sounds like you've done a great job. I might even suggest what you could do. That cardboard and mulch is going to degrade through the course of the summer. You may want to look at taking a piece of black plastic and putting that down on top. And it's a great way to kill weeds, to kill invasives. It's called solarizing. And what we're doing is we're using black plastic and the heat warming effect from the sun to heat up that soil so hot that it kills the invasive plants or the weeds that you're trying to get rid of. And then when you pull that back, you're going to have a bare soil that you can then easily use to plant your native plants. That's actually, if you have a larger patch where you want to get rid of the existing plants, but without pulling them out, that's solarizing with black plastic during the summer, or at least during the sunny season, is definitely one of the best natural techniques to create a soil that's easily workable for new plants. Okay, what are your thoughts on tea compost? A great question. I love that. So I don't have it here in front of me, but I do. We do actually create a soil aid tea kit for those folks that want to create a liquid compost or something that can be applied in a liquid format. You can always take the worm manure, put it and soak it in some water. This will be effective in a limited way. Some of those microbes will get into the water. You can then use it to water your plant. But the best way to create a compost tea is to use a really rich, biologically diverse compost, such as the worm castings, the worm manure. But then you also want to add a little microbial food to that liquid and let it steep for anywhere from about 6 to 8 hours. By adding some microbial food, you're going to allow that microbial population that is on the worm manure to really grow explosively. Because again, remember, microbes live in water, they grow in water, and when you add them to water, they need food to be able to grow their population. So that's exactly what's in our soil aid tea kit is the microbial food, the worm manure, and then the instructions on how to do that, along with your little tea bag that allows you to soak your worm castings and your microbial food. The important thing to remember here is that you can't let your compost tea or your soil aid tea sit for more than 12 hours. After 12 hours, the good bacteria, the good biology that's been growing has started to use up all the oxygen, and it starts to become a water, a liquid that doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it. As soon as this happens, there's a shift in the ecosystem or the preference in the biology, and pathogenic bad, what we're talking about is the bad microbes start taking over. Things that are detrimental to soil, things that are detrimental to our health. This is really a critical piece. I always say that making a compost tea is an advanced level maneuver because it can be really effective when it's done properly and when it's monitored and used within that 6 to 8 hour window. But as soon as you let it go too long or let it sit too long, you verge into a territory where it can actually have a detrimental effect. Again, using your watch, using a timer is your best option for knowing when that's happened. The other thing is the nose knows. That's one of the tips we use here in the compost industry and in the soil health industry is that if it smells bad, it probably has bad microbes in it. We as humans evolved to be able to tell when something is not right, when there's something in there that might not be healthy for us. And so I always say if something smells bad, whether it's your compost tea or a bag of soil you bought from Dollarama or the hardware store, if something about it to you suggests that it's going to make you feel unwell, then chances are that is not a healthy soil. Probably it hasn't had access to oxygen, which encourages the bad microbes to grow. So compost tea, definitely a great option if you're feeling confident, and the soil aid tea kit will give you all the instructions on how to do that. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We're just wrapping up here. I really appreciate you joining me today. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. Feel free to email me, jocelyn@wastenotfarms.com. Again, if you want to take advantage, get yourself some mulch to protect the soil at your home, in your containers or indoor plants. You can use the code FREEMULCH and you will get a free bag of the wood chips mulch with your purchase at soilbooster.ca until April 30th. Thank you so much. I really appreciate seeing you. Looking forward to having you again next time. Have fun growing healthy plants, healthy people, and a healthy planet. Anytime now. Anytime now.